Uh, Hello, everyone, and good morning and good evening. Uh, Welcome to the CLPR seminars. Today is my a special pleasure to introduce Professor Kim KORINEK. She is actually a long friend of CIPR. Actually, she is the very first visiting foreign scholar to our institution when CIPR was established, and then we welcomed Kim as the very first, major scholar visiting our center. And thank you so much for the visiting. I believe you make a lot of friends and also expand your network. And this time you coming back, you'll see more friends are gathering here. Okay. All right. Let me formally introduce Professor Kim KORINEK. Professor Kim KORINEK is a professor of sociology at the University of Utah in the Salt Lake City, United States. Uh, she currently directs the University of Utah's Asian Center. This is a Title IV National Resource Center for Asian Studies. Uh, Professor KORINEK's research focus on aging and the life course, international migration, health and mortality, especially among the immigrants and conflict-affected populations. As you may realize, this is especially during the COVID period of time. This is a very important research field. She is the principal investigator of the NIH-funded project titled Health and Aging Post-Conflict, War's Enduring Effects Among the Survivors in Vietnam. Professor KORINEK also leads the Henry Luce Foundation-funded Mekong Region Development Research Group Initiative, which focuses on the scholar exchange and methodological training among the North American and Southeast Asian researchers. Without further ado, let me invite Professor Kim KORINEK.
Right. Thank you, Tusha, for such a generous and kind introduction. And I do want to say it's great to see so many old friends and new friends here. And I'm excited to present the talk. I'll sort of preface it by saying this is work in progress and sort of fresh off the press work. So bear with me, and I will very much appreciate the comments that you have from me. So let me quickly share the screen. Okay.
I think you're in. Okay, good.
Yep. That's good. Yeah, I have two screens set up, and so it takes a while to move things around. So first of all, I want to acknowledge my several co-authors on the project. I first want to say that Yvette Young is a postdoctoral scholar here, and she deserves a great deal of credit on this paper. She's an excellent quantitative methodologist, and none of us could do it without her. Jefferson Schmidt is actually an undergraduate student at the U, was when we started this project, and he's now a med student. He was in a class of mine and expressed a lot of interest in the project and became involved. We have collaborators from Canada, from University of Washington, from Hanoi, and important also is my colleague and yours, Puktir Wichachinan, who is a co-PI on this project. So we have support from the NIH, and this is, how to say this, for many of us, I think a labor of love. We really have a real profound appreciation for and respect for the Vietnamese people and elders that are in our study and all of our colleagues there. So change the title a little bit to sort of get this framework centered on this idea of war survival and thinking about how war survival affects aging. And I don't have to tell this crowd, I'm sure, that when we're thinking about age and aging, we really need to be thinking about it as a multidimensional concept and process. So we often in this project think about chronological age as it compares to biological age. So we do also have extensive biomarker data that's associated with this project, so we can understand and think about how biological aging has been affected depending upon how people were exposed to different wartime stressors. We also think a lot in this particular study about subjective age, or this sort of sense or perception of one's age. And then it's also really important, I think, to be thinking about this sort of divergent pace at which different populations age and why that is the case. Why do we see that? And so if we think about, what leads to this experience, this perception, and leads someone to feel younger than their actual chronological age, or to feel older than one's chronological age. And I think, Chisha, you brought up this, COVID earlier, this idea that I think a lot of us feel older with the pandemic happening, right? We're experiencing a lot of stress. We're thinking about and maybe are experiencing people, hopefully not, but people experiencing mortality and morbidity around us. And so it has it demonstrates how subjective age is malleable, right? Like how the age that we feel may also change depending on our particular point in the life course and events that are happening. So in the interest of time, I can't go over every study and every sort of set of results that have been generated around subjective age or feeling older or younger than one's chronological age. But I want us to think about a couple of broad sets of explanations. And I thought there were a couple of good images. And I have no idea how old these women are, but they, to me, capture these very different experiences of age and aging. And one seems to capture a lot more vitality and active, successful aging. And one at least appears to be active, but perhaps having more of the stressors and maybe some deprivation of material resources. And clearly there's context that is a part of this, right? Context and life experience that lead to these really different experiences of how old one feels. Imagining if we were to ask them how old they feel relative to their chronological age. So some of the past research has pointed to major predictors of subjective age being underlying physical health conditions, functional health conditions such as activities of daily living limitations, also functional limitations, psychological well-being, and then subjective age is also really wrapped up in the social relationships and the economic or material well-being of individuals. These sort of prop up and can support a feeling of relative youth into late adulthood. And then there is a bit of research that demonstrates that the cultural context does matter. Is that context one where there is age discrimination? Is aging something that is looked down upon? Do older people experience relative degrees of stigma or discrimination? And if that is the case, how do they perceive themselves? And then there's a bit of research that's starting to emerge and where we're trying to contribute is thinking about early life experiences as they can influence this sense of aging. And those early life experiences, even stressors, ones that we define as stressful or traumatic, can be either scarring or can produce resilience into later adulthood. So just a couple of points to set the stage for this particular research question. So most of the subjective age research that has been conducted, and this research has been going on since the 1950s, and it's really had an upswing since a lot of more recent studies have incorporated biological markers. But there's a heavy biomedical perspective underlying this understanding of what's relatively a psychological construct and understanding of self. But more recently, scholars, especially like Yannick Stefan, who I feel like he's written about half of the papers on subjective aging, and subjective age really is talking about the importance of merging biomedical and psychosocial perspectives and seeing those as integrated. And more so, and this is sort of a parallel literature, a lot of life course principles suggest that early life experiences can shape subjective age, so that it's not just an experience of the past or experiences of the recent past, but experiences of the distant past that influence how old we feel or how young we feel. And then subjective age research has been quite narrow geographically. There is a bit of recent research on subjective age in Asia, which does suggest that the cultural context matters in influencing this. So if you look back at the literature on subjective age a while ago, which was more narrowly focused and conducted in Western settings, there was a sense of it's universal. Like as people get older, they feel relatively younger. And that's essentially not what you see in a lot of, especially Asian contexts. I was looking today just to make sure I could say this. I have not seen a lot of publications within Singapore focused on subjective age. Korean studies, I think there are about 4, and these are all published within the last several years. And so this study, the focus on Vietnam in this study is really, I think, adding that cultural and sort of adding depth to their breadth to the cultural context in which we're looking at this process or this concept. But also importantly, adding this rich data source, but also a context that was affected by conflict for many decades. So there are, again, very few studies of subjective age that focus on lower and middle income countries. So pretty neglected world regions, as well as development levels. So if we think about subjective age, we're trying to bring in the intersection of life course, social context, and biology in these models that we use to analyze this important outcome. And I didn't mention earlier, I should have mentioned that another reason we're really interested in subjective age, aside from a dimension of aging, is that it's highly and strongly predictive of morbidity and mortality. It is actually a better predictor, has a sort of better explanatory value for longevity and survivorship than chronological age, asking people what age they feel. So I mentioned earlier, subjective age, we're increasingly seeing in the literature is malleable, and it's informed by contexts of stress and adversity. Stefan and colleagues recently conducted a longitudinal analysis. There's quite a few studies that look at subjective age and how it does change over time. But what they did see is that in part because of people's changing social relationships and their social connectedness, as well as greater stress levels, subjective age is much older. So people are more likely to feel older in the post-pandemic period than prior to COVID. And that's from a North American context. And this is one amongst several other studies that are really getting to, implementing that life course perspective to show that subjective age doesn't materialize in an instant, but it stems from lifelong socially embedded developmental experiences. And once we understand that and see that, I think there's a way to think about subjective age as something that could be positively malleable, right? And malleable through different levers that might be policy or programs for older people. So we're starting to see, and this is a lot of this is coming from our project, from our colleagues on the Vietnam Health and Aging study, that the adversities and traumas experienced during war, even 40 years prior, amongst survivors, have generally an acceleration effect on the aging process. And so we're looking at that with respect to subjective age in this paper, but in a paper that is under review with our colleague Zach Zimmer, we found the same thing for frailty, and we've also seen associations between war exposure and psychological health, also cardiovascular disease, and a range of other really important outcomes for older adult health and well-being. There's also, in like probably the study that is most closely parallel to what we have done in the Vietnam context. There is a group of scholars at Tel Aviv University in Israel who have looked at several different samples, ex-POWs, other individuals who've been exposed to violence in the wars between Israel and Palestine. And what they're finding is that conflict affected older adults in Israel experience and exhibit older subjective age as compared to those who have had fewer, less severe exposures of that kind. They also find like a really strong association or pathway through post-traumatic stress disorder. And that has led people like Sharon Avador and others to talk about this concept of embattled survival, this idea that when individuals experience the stressors of war and are then later kind of coping with the challenges of PTSD, they tend to report feeling older, in part because it makes it harder to cope with the challenges and the stressors of just normal aging because they have this extra burden, right? So they're embattled by their experience as survivors of war. There's another part of this literature that people have sort of referred to a healthy warrior effect. And we sort of think about this in a slightly different way, in that we know we're looking at a select population of everyone who has survived war in this population, but in particular, those who were in the military who've survived many years of combat and long deployments. They may have a particular sort of psychosocial set of attributes, as well as economic resources as a result of their service, particular benefits in terms of healthcare and pensions that others may not. So we want to be thinking about adversities and traumas of war and how they relate to aging, but then also how there might be some groups that experience some benefits of those experiences. Okay, so I'm going to hop into the data a little bit to get you sort of primed for thinking about subjective age as an outcome variable and in this particular social context. So I neglected to add a very detailed set of information about the context of Vietnam and how this particular cohort of older adults experienced the war. I'm happy to say more about that later, if that's helpful. So, but I want to first show you how our respondents in the BHAS report on their subjective age. So they were asked or said, I know that you are currently, say, 75 years old. The average age in the sample is 70. The whole sample is age 60 and older. So I know that you're currently 75 years old, but people sometimes feel younger or older than their age. Do you feel younger, older, or about your age? And as you can see, this sample tends to feel relatively old. Their subjective age tends to be the most common, the most often reported outcome is older than their age. And I want to show you what this looks like in the HRS conducted in the United States. It's pretty much a reversal of the pattern. And I checked on this, and we see much more of the older adults in the HRS indicating they feel younger than their age, despite the fact that the average age of the samples is about 1.5 years different. So it's not a sample, in that regard, a sample, age distribution difference. And that leads us to think about our question, is this cultural, right? Is there something about the culture, the regard for aging and older people, or does this relate to the heavy experience of difficulties related to war, stressors and sort of ill experiences in the life course? So we have a few hypotheses about this, and this really grows out of our sort of stress process and life course theory and some of our past research and what we've seen with respect to veterans in particular. So based on past research, we're hypothesizing that individuals with greater exposure to wartime stressors during their early adulthood will feel older than their chronological age as compared to those with fewer or lesser exposures. individuals who have experienced, and this is linked to war, but also linked to the present period and the locations that we're working in. Those who have experienced nutrition deficiency or poor nutrition, food insecurity, trying to come up with a catch-all term for this, what we're looking at here, who have experienced that either in early or late adulthood will feel older than their chronological age, as compared to those who have not experienced that particular type of deprivation or hardship. Third, we hypothesize that veterans will be unique as a result of the resources and the status that they have in the society. And so despite their wartime stress exposures, military veterans will feel subjectively younger or less likely to feel old compared to their chronological age. And finally, we're hypothesizing this is about the structure or the nature of the relationship, that these past experiences of war and food shortage and sort of deprivation that took place in early adulthood, that there will both be those direct effects on subjective age, but they will also be mediated by current physical health and psychological distress. So there will be a pathway through these, through physical health and psychological well-being or distress that is part of the way that war matters for subjective aging. Okay, so this is the Vietnam Health and Aging Study. We have a sample that we drew of 2,447 adults age 60 and older, who we label as the American War cohort. They experienced childhood, mostly adolescence and young adulthood during the peak decade of the American War from 1965 to 1975. And it's hard to put bounds around the war. And we sampled, some of our sample is, closer to 100 years old. So they would have been quite a bit older at that time, but would have experienced other wars, the war with the French, for example. So in short, it's a population of older adults that experience a spectrum of war exposures, whether or not they were in the military or in militias, or were non-combatants and not in the military, but experienced war through different pathways in their surroundings. A little bit more on the sampling. We wanted in this sample to capture differential aerial or sort of aggregate exposure to a particular type of war exposure, and that's aerial bombing. And so we purposefully selected districts from which to sample our population that had the lowest levels of bombing to the highest levels of US bombing during this time period within what was North Vietnam or the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And so that's a question people often ask is why just the North? And it has to do with, a lot of it is with budgets and convenience, but we did try to capture as much variance as we could on that outcome or that type of exposure to war bombing. But we also in our study, and most of the measures that we feature in this analysis are looking at types of war stress exposure that were experienced at the individual level, whether people witnessed and saw death and dying, lost family members, were injured in the war zone, etc. So we have a lot of measures that there'll be a lot of variance, for example, in one district in terms of the individual level exposures that people report. There's an extensive omnibus survey that has a wide battery of questions on war stress exposure, current health, and family relationships, social support, engagement, etc. Then we also have biomarker data. We feature it in a pretty limited way in this paper. So the analytical approach that we're going to use in this paper, and I'll turn to some of the covariates in more detail before we get into these. We're we have a three category dependent variable. So we're using an MLOGIT and a survey adjusted generalized structural equation model to get at and understand the mediating pathways of comorbidities and psychological distress through which war exposure affects subjective age. So our outcome variable is subjective age, and there are two outcomes: feeling older or feeling younger relative to feeling about the same as one's chronological age. We have three sets of explanatory variables. One is war-related stressors. The second is indicators of nutrition status, both early and late life, and then a set of health and stress conditions in the recent period. The mediators are recent psychological distress. We measure this using the self-reporting questionnaire, SRQ, which is 7 items, binary items indicating emotional and physical expressions of distress, and measure of comorbidities, which is a count of current chronic conditions, 8 of them, such as heart disease, COPD, and diabetes. The control
sorry, Kim, to interrupt. Can you say a bit more about this key measurement of war-related stress? How do you measure
that? Yes, I'm going to do that. I'll do that in the next slide.
Oh, sure. Okay.
I've broken it down into, that's great.
Sorry.
You're getting ahead of me. No, that's perfectly fine. So yeah, I should have put it earlier, but anyhow, it's coming. The control covariates are age, sex, educational attainment, a measure of household assets as an indicator of wealth, which is a principal components analysis based index, and then the district of residence, which is picking up on those aerial measures. And that's why we use a survey adjusted model as well, because we have clustering within those areas. And then our analytical sample is about 2,300 individuals. So the next slide shows what those, and I'll talk through them. I didn't provide every single item of our stress, war stressors, but I can give you some examples. So our war-related stress exposures or war-related exposures, okay, this top one is duplicated and it shouldn't be there. So like, imagine that's not the severe childhood hunger, it's in both categories. So we look at war-related stress exposures, first of all, just by categorizing individuals as whether they were in the formal military, in a militia. So there was extensive involvement of especially young people and women in different militia organizations. And then the other category is those who were just not in any military organization at all. We look at war stress exposure along a couple of dimensions. So first of all, we have an indicator of the extent to which we have individual items, 11 of them, that capture experiences during the war related to either experiences during combat or those that would have been sort of a closeness or a proximity or a witnessing of death. Death of Vietnamese soldiers, having seen or witnessed death or severe injury of soldiers, of civilians, of American soldiers. Also for those who were in combat situations or in the military, if they were in combat operations, if they experienced being fired upon, ambushed, a sort of set of direct sort of threat indicators, having lost a close buddy in combat, that sort of thing. And those are adopted from a couple of different existing exposure scales that have mostly been used in the Western context in relationship to Vietnam veterans here, American veterans of the Vietnam War, as well as other broader indices of looking at war zone trauma exposures. And then there's a malevolent environment index, and this captures aspects of environment that all sort of people who are living in conflict zones may experience, such as limited access to clean water that resulted in sort of illness or sickness, food shortage, having to flee one's village or be evacuated, fear of being killed. So a range of stressors there as well. But one is more about an environment and one is more about these experiences of death and combat. The food shortage or nutrition variables that we include are whether individuals report having experienced in childhood one or multiple episodes of severe hunger, so severe that it resulted in sickness or weakness. And a lot of the population experienced that. And that could have been due to war, or it also could have been due to just economic difficulty between wars. We have several biomarker indicators that would be capturing the current status of health and nutrition related health. And these could be due to sort of like an accumulation over the life course or more current conditions. So we look at calf circumference, which is one of the common indicators of sarcopenia or lean muscle mass that is associated with frailty. Underweight BMI, and I'm realizing I put in the wrong slide. I had modified this. So underweight BMI, we compare to what is considered normal BMI in this context. And then we have those who are at increased risk or greater risk for obesity, but there's just not a lot of overweight or obesity in our population. So that topmost, highest risk, oh, there it is. The highest risk is over 27.5, and it's a very small share of the sample. And then the percentile of hematocrit, and we're not finding anything terribly significant with hematocrit, but that would be an indicator of deficiency that and a level of that would indicate anemia. So it's one of the blood-based biomarkers that we have at this point from the study. Health and stress conditions also are in the model as a set of main predictors, and we look at ADL limitations, a set of 5 functional limitations, a set of 7, these are count outcomes, and then a set of distressing life events experienced within the last couple of years. Things like having lost a spouse, having had a major residential move, having had a major economic shock within the household. Okay, so now I'm going to pause and let you know that I'm moving on to the models. And I'm going to show you, I'll show 4 models in turn, 4 path diagrams. First, the 2 mediators and how these 3 sets of variables connect with or are associated with the 2 mediators, comorbidities and psychological distress. Then I'll show the association of these 3 with the subjective age, the outcome, and then the full set of model results. And I'm just going to focus on the outcome of feeling older relative to feeling one's age. And I can talk about, there's fewer significant associations between, for the feeling younger than one's chronological age. I think they're interesting, but it's, I don't want to spend too much time going through those. So this is ultimately about what are the predictors of feeling older than one's chronological age, accelerated aging. And I apologize, it's hard to feature, their models are complex and dense, and it's hard to get it all in one slide, but hopefully they're relatively visible. So this is the equation showing the key explanatory variables and their association with psychological distress. And we're just showing, and these are not just all, the solid line doesn't mean they're just significant at the 0.05 level, the p.05, they might be higher than that, but we're trying to simplify. And we did also want to show when we were approaching, so when we had the sort of marginal significance at the p at around, between 0.10 and 0.05. And so what we can see is that psychological distress is greater or is associated with these exposures to wartime violence with that index. That's a significant association, as is having experienced more malevolent environments during wartime. And both types of military service, having experienced those, results in more psychological distress. And that's in comparison to those who never served in either type of organization. And there's just marginal significance with an association between having that experience of severe hunger and later life psychological distress. We do see that both types of BMI that are greater, so there's less psychological distress for those, this is an interesting finding, those who are closer to approaching overweight and obesity in this context are less likely to be psychologically distressed. And so we think this is maybe something unmeasured having to do with material well-being and social status if you're actually, not frail and not underweight. And then we also see a lot of strongly significant associations between limitations, ADL limitations, functional limitations, and experiencing, this is almost tautological, but if you experience recent life event stressors, you experience more psychological distress. So those go together. So this next path diagram is showing the same set of associations with comorbidities. And ignore just look at the legend is including too much information. So it should just be, the only two options here are P, we're only showing the path line if they're 0.05 or 0.10. And so with comorbidities, there is a significant association also with this exposure to violence index, weaker associations with malevolent environment and informal service, and some associations with our nutritional deficiency measures, including severe hunger as a child, and then these associations that are picked up by our BMI indicator. So both underweight and approaching obesity, right? The risk for obesity categories, each are associated with a higher risk of comorbidities as compared to normal weight. And then all comorbidities associate with limitations, functional ADLs, and recent stressful life events. Looking at how these associate with the outcome of interest, our subjective age and feeling subjectively older than one's chronological age. We see here that there's a couple things to point out. There's marginal significance in a direct association between those malevolent conditions of wartime. Formal military service, those who served in the formal military are actually less likely to feel older than their subjective age. Those who are underweight, those who have sort of their calf circumference as a threshold measure, they're in the bottom 10 percentile for their gender, or for their sex, I should say. There's a positive association, and then associations with functional limitations and recent stressful life events. Okay, and then the final model, and this is where it gets particularly dense, and so I'll just let you have a look at it. And I'll say, look for the purple and look for the solid. So this diagram is showing both the strength of the association and pointing to variables where there's a direct association only with subjective age, only an indirect association, or a direct plus one or two indirect mediating pathways. And so, to sum this up, it's quite challenging, but I think it brings, into focus the importance of bringing together the biological and the psychosocial and thinking in a life course way, that there's a holistic way to think about what is producing one's sense of subjective age. And then when we think about this particular sample of conflict affected population, we do need to be thinking about things that they experienced during wartime, malevolent environment conditions that have shown up in other studies that we've done to be really sort of have a long-standing robust effect on health outcomes in later life is operating through several pathways, as well as a direct pathway. The recent life event stressors and functional limitations really fit also with the sense that people feel older when they're coping with the difficulties that life throws at them, whether that's, inability to take care of their needs, their functional needs, but then also are facing life event stressors. And then there's a wide range of ways that what we're calling nutrition related health outcomes are also creating this sense of, or influencing this sense of subjective age and feeling old. Okay. How am I doing on time? Can I ask? Do I have I'm getting to my wrap up slide. So I just want to.
Yeah, it's okay. Good.
Yeah.
Good timing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. So first a discussion, and this is really kind of relating back to our hypotheses. So the stressors of war, and especially malevolent environments that surrounded everyone. This was referred to as sort of total war, and a war that affected all social strata, affected young and old and men and women. And they all, and many experience these particularly difficult environments. And these so there's evidence to suggest that these are subjectively aging survivors. The wartime stress and subjective age association is partially mediated by current psychological distress and comorbidities. There are some indicators of poor nutrition in late life that are associated with older subjective age. And I will say that we're not totally satisfied with those measures. We have a wave 2 data collection that had gotten started and now is on hold. I think we collected about 1/6 of our wave 2 data, and we have much better nutrition and food security measures there. But we do know that this is a population that experienced food shortage. There's other studies and sort of accounts that suggest like severe shortage where foraging to survive for big chunks of their lives, and then having related deficiencies and poor nutrition. So we're trying to bring in more of that, but that also is a feature of subjective aging. And then we are seeing again that they're compared to non-veterans, there is some premium when it comes to subjective age that military veterans are experiencing. They're less likely to feel older than their chronological age. And that's after you've sort of pulled out the stressors that they've experienced and controlled for that in the models. Okay. So there's certainly some limitations. This is a rich and unique data source. There's a lot of challenges with studying conflict-affected populations. You can't very easily collect data in a population that is in the midst of conflict, so it's always after the fact. And this one is like 40 years after the fact. So there's a lot of selective survival that's influencing the observed associations. We're conscious of that. We have ways to try to parse that out by looking at who has survived, by looking at civship and differential survival amongst the siblings of our sample. The models do not yet include likely almost certain bidirectionality in some of these associations. There was a recent study, a 2021 study, that was one of the few that has looked at bidirectionality with respect to subjective age, and found significant bidirectional association between frailty and subjective age, so that they're working in a reciprocal way. We have more biomarkers, but they have not yet been assayed, and so we're sort of at a standstill. And so there's other studies that folks using, for example, the HRS have seen that inflammation and just other physiological processes are linked to stress exposure and linked to subjective age. And we do want to be able to look at those mechanisms as well, but we haven't the data yet in the point where we can analyze it. And then subjective age, we have a categorical measure. It'd be better to ask, know more about how subjectively old people feel. And it's on a singular dimension about felt age. There's other ways to think about subjective age as well. And so, wave 2 data is coming. We don't know when it'll be done because of COVID. It should have been done about now, but we're being patient. But once we have that, we'll have more ability to assess bidirectionality and longitudinal associations between subjective age and health and longevity. And so concluding, we have this population that feels so old. And even when you talk to people in the field, like they feel so old, and they feel much older than the HRS respondents and even some of those older folks in the other Asian contexts where people have studied subjective age. And, we're trying to understand, and I think we're taking steps towards understanding how much of that is a result of these life course experiences, and as well as recent stressors that might be sort of that end product of these cumulative processes that started with really severe early life stressors. There's also the sense that there are embattled survivors in their subjective age, reflects that sort of sense of that struggle to survive and cope with PTSD and distress that is at least partly linked to their early life experiences. But yet military members, there's something going on there that's quite interesting that we need to understand better. And then, I think this has just been for us a really interesting sort of step into this really interesting concept of subjective age and thinking about how the value of incorporating not just biological and psychosocial mechanisms that people have been advocating for, but also to incorporate a deeper life course perspective and thinking about those early life stressors. So I will, a few references that we've looked at, not all of them, but a few for the presentation, and then I'll stop there and hope that you have some questions. So thank you so much for listening. And yeah.
Thank you, Kim. This is I can feel this is a very important research question, particularly now the literature about older people in conflict and crisis kind of rising up because of the COVID-19. Thank you very much. And then now I have I think firstly Hu Shu has a question. Hu Shu, can you raise your question directly? Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Kim. Hu Shu here. Thank you so much for your very interesting talk. I have a couple of questions or maybe comments. I'm quite curious. You have shown in the presentation over 70% of Americans, they feel younger than their chronological age. And I'm wondering if the US is kind of special, or is it commonly observed among the Western developed countries with a high level of prosperity? So, and my second comment is kind of related to what you said during the presentation about some cultural explanation between the patterns in Vietnam and US. I'm wondering if in the US, there's, the pop culture, there's a strong bias towards youth, basically, and the ageism might be stronger, probably in the US context. And in Vietnam and maybe other East Asian contexts where there's a Confucian tradition, maybe there's more respect for age, for aging people. So I wonder if this could be part of the explanation. And about the finding on military veterans, they are less likely to feel older than their chronological age. So you talked about the role of economic benefits and maybe some psychosocial benefits. Probably part of it is related to them being survivors. So it seems for this group of people, because on the one hand, they are much more exposed to the war stress. So, but on the other hand, so it seems there's quite a complicated dynamics going on. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, and whether there are plans to tease out these competing mechanisms. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Those are all really great questions and things I've been thinking about a lot. I think in some cases, all I can do is sort of posit, possible explanations. I think for the last question, yeah, we would like to maybe look at incorporate more into the model to understand what is going on with the veterans, what attributes or resources do they have. But let me go back to the first question about the fact that so many Americans in the HRS report feeling younger than their chronological age. I think that I have not done the comparative research except that by reading the literature and noting that most of it's been conducted in the West, and that earlier on in this field, there was almost this statement of universality that when people begin to feel older, when people become older, they feel younger, right? And they report feeling younger. But that work was all conducted in Western settings, Europe and the United States, or Europe and North America. And my sense is that there is a gap between Europe and the US, and that there's more people who report feeling younger than their chronological age, and that the work I've seen conducted so far in not as many studies, but in South Korea and in China, show that the tendency is more so for feeling older than one's age. And, that's where the question about is it culture or structure or experience? I think it would be really interesting to look at that across settings. But I think there's some capacity to start doing that, perhaps with China and Korea and Vietnam, in some capacity. The reasons why this is, there is some sense that I think culture, both a kind of sense of Confucian, we might think about Confucianism and respect for the position of older people within families and that sort of hierarchical sense, and greater respect and status bestowed on older people. And then the other end of that spectrum, more the Western popular culture and who is featured and who is shown, and older people sort of disappear in Hollywood, right, when they reach a certain age, or they get cast in certain types of roles. And so that, and to me, sort of begs this question: is it Eastern, Western sort of philosophies on aging, or is it having to do with modernization and popular culture that might be, how much does that matter? So I think there's a lot of room for more research that gets at that question about culture or other influences through a comparative lens. So, and I can share the paper. I can't sort of pull them up off the top of my head, but that was the general pattern. And people finding that, like, if in a society where there's a lot of age discrimination, people, want to hold on to that youth. And so they maybe sort of want to perceive and are less willing to sort of admit their age or that they're feeling older.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Kim. Yeah, and there's many other questions.
That last question is just, I've thought about the military veterans and this idea that they've cheated death, so to speak, right? They feel young because they've survived so much and they're still alive, and perhaps that's part of it. Or maybe it's, they have friends that they talk about their youth with that were in the military with them, or maybe it's that they have pensions, and so I think we could look at that sample, that subsample by itself, and see what's unique about them. So, yeah.
Okay, let's move to Abhijit.
Thank you, Jushi. Hi, Kim. Thanks for a terrific talk. I have two questions. One, is there reason to believe that amongst those that have this military experience or military veterans and those who are not, that there might be difference in social networks, particularly stronger or closer networks? And is that possibly something you want to want to explore how that relates to the feeling of being older or younger. I mean, and I don't know the literature on this. I mean, if you have more friends, does one feel older because of that, or younger because you are more active? So that was one. The second was, the very interesting point you mentioned about this differential survivorship among siblings. How would you model that? I'm curious. I mean, would you essentially include that at the individual level, sort of in the analysis, or do you have like a group measure? Or I'm curious how you would do that. It sounds very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. The second one is harder. We haven't utilized that data yet, but there are other studies that have attempted to understand selective survival with SIBSHIP rosters. And it's one thing to sort of say, so if you look at, and these older adults have huge SIBSHIPs, right? They're like, 1 of 10 children. And so you could potentially, if you know something about their family background, their early life background, you might be able to sort of say something about, well, the individuals in our sample who are still alive as compared to those who have passed, right? And have passed because of war, because we ask about the siblings if they're alive or not, and then also if they died as a result of war in some way, like either directly in combat or, some other reasons. And you might be able to look at something to do with their family origin status, the size of the family, their SIBSHIP position, right? Like are they the oldest, youngest, something like that. But then the actual incorporation into the model is more challenging. And we've not yet done that. So I think that's the next step. Yeah. And the social networks, they certainly have different social networks. I should ask Pook if she knows offhand, but generally the veterans, so there's two things happening, right? They would have had potentially enlarged networks because of their service and the mobility, and it got them out of their sort of village, but then also loss of their, potential loss of those networks because they lost them in war. They had early mortality because of their exposures. And so I think there's a couple of things operating there, but we do have, and it should be in this model, measures of social engagement, measures of like connection with, like visits and support from children, marital status. And then for those who served in the military organizations, questions about if they visit with, if they get any help from those people that they met in the military, and then if they're involved like in a veterans association. So those are all really good things to be thinking about, but especially when we get to that bidirectional, I think the bidirectionality gets really wrapped up with those engagement, social engagement and social support measures.
Thank you, Kim. We have a question from Shannon. Let me read it for you. So basically, so how the subjective age related to the aging biomarkers. I mean, this is also one of my concern. Like, I feel like there's a lot of study on chronic age and biological age, BA and CA, and it looks like SA, subjective aging, is a better predictor of BA. According to your result. I mean, because you have the data, I feel it will be very interesting to explore this 3H measurement. So that's the first question of him. Second question, I think basically is about, is it about war? Because it could be the context change, like in Singapore background, people have the similar, symptoms of subjective aging because of the social change rather than war itself. So how can we analytically deal with this? So basically, these are the two questions. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's a really good question. And we're trying our best to sort of parse out the more contemporary. There's so much intervening time between the war and then between the contemporary period where we are assessing their, people's socioeconomic status. And we are getting at especially the difficult piece of the community or the district that they live in could be important because it was heavily bombed, or it could be important because of its development status. And those might be interconnected, right? So it's very challenging. I think to the extent that we can have those more proximate measures of well-being that are economic and social, then we can talk about these predictors of war being salient.
Thank you. Pook, you have a question? Yeah.
Well, along the line of like, you know, what influenced people's subjective aging, right? I wonder, and you know, it's interesting when you show that comparison with HRS, and I wonder if ideational change could actually affect how one feels about that age too, right? Like in the US, there are so many talks about like productive aging, active aging, whereas in Vietnam, maybe that sort of conversation, especially in rural areas and in places where we, you know, did our study, you know, that message hasn't really got there yet. I wonder, you know, that might be one thing, but I don't think it's possible for us to prove. But
I
just
think,
some thoughts.
yeah, I think it's really, I mean, that whole idea of the malleability of it, and that it, you know, that it's not only just like, you might feel really young 1 month and then a lot older the next month because of what you've been going through and what's happening in the world. Like that's one thing, but then also there's malleability in terms of ideational change, right? All of the Arlene Thornton sort of ideas, right? Like idealism, and you know, if there is more, and I think Hushu's question kind of touched upon this too. How could there be a positive effect perhaps of this popular culture, right? We don't like it when the older people are erased from television, but maybe if that makes people want to feel and think about themselves as younger, they might have better health. I don't know. But that, you know, that first slide that I showed with the, you know, that really vital looking younger woman doing or older woman who was sort of doing the exercise, and the other that kind of represented this other end of a spectrum of a harder life where maybe that productive aging idea wasn't present. That I think, you know, there's a lot, the psychological is really powerful, right? In our sample, we don't have enough variation in that, but I think if you compared, you know, look at what are the harmonized HRS studies, for example, that have subjective age, that could be an interesting exercise. So.
Kim, can I also ask a question? We still have about 5 minutes. The thing is, it's very interesting to see the contrast between United States and Vietnam. They both got involved in wars, and that means that America is also having this war experience. Yeah. But how come, you know, subjective aging has been affected differently? My question is like, war itself may have different pathways affecting people. So my first question is, how about the veterans in the United States? Maybe they have lower subject. This is my hypothesis. You know, work differently from Vietnam. Okay, yeah. That's my first hypothesis. I don't know whether it's right or not. That's my first question. Secondly, I'm thinking about. It's very interesting that because this is lifelong effect. So I don't know whether this kind of self-reported aging phenomena happen only in the old age or right after the war. So this is lifelong. Is it lifelong, you know, outcome in that sense? Okay, certainly. I mean, just technically, the SEM model, I do feel like maybe the nutrition part and also could have pathways linking to the war exposure. So when you model this for your 3 cluster of independent variables,
definitely.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, okay.
No, you're right. All these are really great points. We struggled a lot to figure out like the best way to make a model that could be somewhat parsimonious, but try to capture what we thought was important mediation. But certainly we are thinking about those nutrition indicators and you know, and to accept that BMI is like, it reflects like not only the present sort of like activity balance or whatever, but that it's like, it's the end product of like what life and lifestyle and, you know, diet has been. But that there was a deep famine that killed many people, but also left many people without food for a long time in the 40s. And then there was a war with the French that left many people without access to food regularly. And then there was a war with the Americans, and lots of different populations. Those who were serving too, when they were in the field, really struggled. And so it's first of all, it's just really hard to get good measures retrospectively of experiences of hunger and detailed experiences of hunger. I think like qualitative data would be great to sort of flesh that out better than just asking about like, did you experience hunger? And to understand it more deeply, because half the sample said they did experience at a month duration of severe hunger, like where they were ill or, weak. So yeah, I agree. There's a path most likely there that we should be thinking about. And then the question about the US veterans. So first of all, I mean, thinking about war encompassing everyone in Vietnam versus a subset of men in the US. There have been studies that have looked at veterans in the US and veterans in other settings, and war exposure and then PTSD does make them feel older, right?
I see.
It does suggest
very
that.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and we've talked about doing on this paper to get at this, to understand better the culture versus like life course experiences, is to almost like simulate with a group of individuals who had very little war exposure and a more easy life in that setting, but had the culture, the Vietnamese culture, but then those who had those more extreme exposures and very difficult life, and see like, does that easy life population without all the structural and war stressors like feel younger, right? Yeah. That would be a way to understand better, like what explains that big difference between those two. So
thank you so much. We have 1 minute. If there's no, let me see. Oh, no question. Thank you very much. Let us please join me to thank Professor KORINEK again for this very wonderful and fancy study. Thank you, Kim, and look forward to meet you, okay, in the near future.
And I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day and listening and the great questions. And also just to say, NUS and CFPR is like close to my heart, and I missed my time there, and I hope to visit you again soon.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.